have, make sure you click that button to let it record. And then you'll be able to see my screen as well. So yeah, we're super excited for this event today. Thank you so much. We've been kind of talking a lot about how do we not only, start having events for Medical Her Story that share a message and talk about storytelling and about destigmatizing healthcare spaces, but how do we also bring that in and create, skills and opportunities for people to interact with professionals in the field to really understand how to, get started in your career, but also in your personal journey in gender health equity. So today I'm extremely excited that we're going to be focusing on how to write about gender health equity. We're going to have an incredible speaker, honestly, an inspiration. I didn't have a chance to say this to Sarah earlier, but your book is actually one of the things that had originally kind of started a lot of the discussions in this organization. And so you being here is such an honor. So we're really excited to hear Sarah speak. But before we get to that, I just want to quickly go over some Zoom rules. So please just remain muted if you're not speaking. If comfortable, definitely keep your camera on. It's always super lovely to see everyone's faces. Feel free to use the chat if you'd like. We also have some active listeners present. I'm an active listener, so you can always reach out to me if you need anything. As always, be respectful and inclusive to everyone. And also just note that closed captions are enabled, so you can activate them at any time during the event. Oh, that went way too far. So there we go. So before we get started, I'm going to do a quick land acknowledgement. So although we are located all around the world, I would like to start off today by acknowledging the land on which Medical Her Story was founded on. So Medical Her Story acknowledges that our events and spaces for discussion take place in the traditional territory of the indigenous peoples, such as the Kanien'kehá:ka, on the island known as Montreal or Tiohtià:ke. This island has also historically served as a meeting place for other indigenous nations. We cannot begin to discuss patient advocacy, barriers to accessing health and care, or internalized stigma without recognizing the role that colonialization, white supremacy, and medical racism play in the social structures which healthcare as an institution is situated in. I call upon my colleagues and friends, everyone in this meeting, here to join me in ongoing efforts towards reconciliation by committing to learn and grow in a manner that will honor our diverse communities and peoples, no matter where we are from and no matter the settings in which we hold space. And as always, if you've been to any events that we've hosted in the past, you'll know that I will always encourage you to really learn about the land on which you reside. There's amazing resources such as www.native-land.com that will really teach you about the land that you're on, the peoples that this land belongs to, and to really start that process on your own time, but also as a community here at Medical Her Story. So I'm going to quickly just go over the program hosts. Two of our program hosts, unfortunately, could not be here today. But I'm Daria. I am the events director at Medical Her Story. I'm sure you've probably seen my face at other events if you've attended them. I've been with Medical Her Story for about almost 2 years now, and I feel like we're just getting started. So I'm really excited to see to keep working with everyone on this program and to keep meeting all of you. Elle, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Elle. I use the pronouns she and her. I joined as an events coordinator at Medical Her Story just over a year ago, which is crazy how fast time flies. I can't believe that I've already been working with this amazing organization for so long. But yeah, just like Daria, I'm really excited about our upcoming gender health equity program. We have lots of exciting stuff that we have planned, and I'm super excited to work towards that.
So before we get started, I know that most of you probably know what Medical Her Story is, but just in case you're new to this series or to our events, we're really just a nonprofit space that's dedicated towards storytelling, towards destigmatizing healthcare spaces, and about using our shared experiences and reflections and personal and professional careers to really drive change in gender health equity and ensuring that everyone has access to safe, equitable, and inclusive healthcare. I'm going to pass it off to Elle now to kind of, if you don't know much about the program yet, to give a really brief overview before we get into the actual part that you're all here for, which is to hear Sarah speak. So yeah, go ahead, Elle.
Yeah, so we started the Gender Health Equity Program in order to create a space for everyone who was really interested in this topic and wanted some more continuous events to not only just learn more about gender health equity, but also network with some people who had similar interests as well. So the Gender Health Equity Program, we're planning on having events every 4 to 6 weeks. And these events generally fall under three pillars: education, advocacy, and what was the last one, Daria? I forget, sorry. Empowerment.
Empowerment, yeah.
Empowerment. Yeah. So today's event, which is, oh, sorry, before I move on, so as part of the Gender Health Equity Program, not only do we want to create a network of people who are interested in gender health equity, but we also wanted to make sure that by participating in this program, you were getting something back to you. So we started a gender health, besides just obviously learning more about gender health equity and creating new connections, but we also started this membership and gender health equity training certificate. So you can scan the QR code up on the screen if you haven't fully set that up. But essentially, if you attend 4 or more meetings of this program, you will earn the training certificate, and we record attendance for each event through a feedback form that will be sent out to all of our attendees. So if you could please fill that out, that helps us make these events better and more geared towards what everyone is interested in, so we can make sure that you're getting the most out of these spaces, as well as it can go towards counting towards your training, your gender health equity training certificate. So given all of that said, welcome to the next installment, the second installment that is, of our Gender Health Equity Program. And this event is titled How to Write About Gender Health Equity. And as I kind of jumped ahead before there, this event is part of our education pillar, wherein we're going to try to empower you with the knowledge and skills necessary to advance gender health equity in both your personal and professional spheres. Today, we're doing something really exciting in that we're exploring the intersection between writing and gender health equity. And to do so, we're doing a book club style event featuring Sarah Graham, who is the author of the amazing book, I have it right here, Rebel Bodies, A Guide to the Gender Health Gap Revolution. So just to give you a little bit of a preface about Sarah before I give her the chance to introduce herself. For the past decade, Sarah has been really focused through journalism on highlighting the differences in healthcare access and treatment between genders. She was originally motivated by a really deep empathy for women experiencing emotional distress for being overlooked in healthcare settings. And she first started her journey through her blog, Hysterical Woman, which provided a platform for women to share their healthcare experiences and find solidarity. Very aligned with what we do here at Medical Her Story. As Daria mentioned, we were very inspired by her. And this initiative eventually evolved into her book, Rebel Bodies, which continues to advocate for gender equity in healthcare in such an amazingly not only just methodologically impressive, but also the personal anecdotes that she includes in here are very impactful. Today, we are so privileged to have Sarah join us to share her insights. And so with all that being said, welcome, Sarah. I'll pass the floor over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And for those, yeah, that lovely introduction. And equally, I am really inspired by the work that Medical Herstory is doing. So yeah, great to be with you. So I was going to start just by chatting a little bit about my career, and I guess the kind of journey that Elle has alluded there really towards in terms of how Rebel Bodies came to be. So I trained as a journalist. I have a master's in newspaper journalism. And when I graduated from that master's, I got a job on a relatively small online magazine called Feminist Times. It doesn't exist anymore. It didn't last very long because it ran out of money, as feminist organisations so often do. But it was a really brilliant kind of starting place for me. I'd got very interested in feminism while I was a student, and it was a fantastic place to really explore that and to be writing about the issues that I genuinely cared about and felt passionately about, having prior to that done years and years worth of work experience in newsrooms, which felt very still very kind of macho in lots of ways, very kind of male dominated, very much like it was difficult to be heard as a woman, particularly as a young woman at the time. So I got this job, which was basically my dream job, and there were a lot of challenges involved in that, but we were a really small team, and it meant that I got to, I was really thrown in at the deep end. So I was commissioning, I was editing, I was writing, I was doing social media stuff, I was working with membership that we had, I was sending out press releases, so I was doing like our kind of external marketing. And we did have quite a lot of press coverage when we first launched in the UK. And that, as a 23-year-old journalism graduate, was just absolutely out of this world. I was, as I say, working with a really small team where day to day there were just three of us. We had an editorial board, which included Reni Eddo-Lodge before she was famous. So, absolutely amazing women for me to be learning from and with. And yeah, I could write about whatever I wanted, basically. It was the dream. And through that, as I say, I was writing about the whole kind of spectrum of women's issues, really. But I got particularly interested in issues around health. So I'd always been quite interested in sort of reproductive health, reproductive rights, the whole kind of abortion rights discussion. But I also, there was a period where I was deputy editor and my editor had gone on holiday, and we had planned a week's worth of content around mental health. And so I ended up editing that entire week and just got really fascinated by some of the kind of gendered aspects of mental health care that I had never considered before, Particularly, I think a lot of the ways that stereotyping seemed to crop up in mental health care, that women with quite, serious mental illnesses were being dismissed as dramatic, as attention seeking, as drama queens. And so then when that magazine folded about a year into its life, and I was kind of weighing up my options. Do I want to go back to one of those macho newsrooms? Do I want to try and kind of go it on my own? I decided to try freelancing for a bit, just kind of see what happens. I sort of figured I was still young enough, early enough on in my career that I could give it a go. And if it didn't work, I'd just go and get a proper job. And here I am 10 years later, just about to celebrate 10 years of freelancing. So it worked out. But as I started out, so focusing on mental health issues, always, with that kind of feminist perspective. And it was actually through that I was commissioned by a supplement company to write about the links between depression and menopause. And this was 10 years ago. I mean, like long, long before anyone was really talking about the menopause in the media. And so it was something that had never occurred to me. I was 24, 25 at the time. Menopause wasn't really on my radar. And it had never occurred to me that estrogen would have this massive impact on women's mood. So through writing about that, I started, I guess, kind of slightly going back a little bit more to my roots in sort of reproductive and exploring other areas of women's health. I did a lot of work for, again, another online magazine that doesn't exist anymore called The Debrief, which was basically kind of the younger sister of Grazia. And I was doing a lot around reproductive health for them for several years. So, really fantastic articles that I wrote, like really interesting, like what it's actually like to have an abortion in terms of the kind of step by step of what happens, and some really kind of in-depth stuff exploring women's experiences. And then I guess, like all of us, I'm sure, have a sort of light bulb moment when it comes to gender health equity. And for me, although I'd always been writing from a feminist perspective and I'd always been looking at the kind of gendered aspects of health, I'd never really appreciated how big the gender health gap is and how much it spans the whole of healthcare. And I was commissioned by Stylist magazine in kind of early 2018 to write an article about endometriosis. Again, kind of like really early on in the point where endometriosis was starting to be talked about a bit more publicly. And that article was absolutely my light bulb moment. I mean, it completely changed the course of my career because the woman that I interviewed had waited 10 years for an endometriosis diagnosis, which, as you'll all know, is not untypical or unusual. And she had been going to the doctors with her mother. Her mother had previously had endometriosis, and the doctors just kept saying, no, you're being hysterical, your mum's neurotic, she's planted this idea in your head, you're trying to copy her. We're not even going to refer you to gynecology. We'll, I think they stuck her on the pill or something, typical kind of thing that they do. And she had been diagnosed at 23, 10 years after her symptoms started. And as a result of this, she now has lifelong bladder issues, lifelong bowel issues, because of the damage that the disease did to her in the 10 years that she was waiting. And some of you, if you've read the whole book, might recognize her story because I featured her in the book about mothers. But that for me was really kind of the point where I thought, shit, this is really bad. And the thing that I was struck by, I guess it's one of those things where once you start noticing sexism and gender gaps, you see them everywhere, right? Like they suddenly are so obvious to you. And I started noticing, I could be writing about menopause. I wrote an article about PMDD around the same sort of time. I could be writing about chronic illness but over and over again, I was hearing the same kind of recurring themes and patterns, which was women saying, I feel like my doctor doesn't listen. I feel I'm not being taken seriously. And I feel really isolated. I feel like I'm on my own. That was something that really upset me, actually, because I thought, actually, I'm hearing this from so many women, and they all feel like they're on their own. They all feel like they're just the one who's being too weak or not coping well enough, or they've been told this is normal and this is what every woman goes through, but it's not. And so that was the thing that really triggered me to start Hysterical Women, because at the time I just thought, I want to prove a point. Essentially, I want to prove to these women that you're not on your own, that this isn't just an individual failing, you're not just weak, and this is happening to lots of people. And I didn't really think too kind of deeply about the wider context at that point. I just thought, let's just make a space where people can share their stories and feel heard and feel listened to and feel believed. And that really is what Hysterical Women was. People could submit their stories, and hundreds of women did submit their stories. And I'm saying women, we did have also some stories from non-binary people who'd been assigned female at birth, but primarily cisgendered women submitting their stories. And that was really powerful. And a lot of it then fed into the other work that I was doing as a journalist. So it inspired a lot of the work that I went on to do as a journalist. It was constantly giving me ideas for stories. Lots of the women ended up being used as case studies, either in articles or in Rebel Bodies. And yeah, I suppose that was sort of, ticking along quite nicely. I ran a couple of sponsored series where I actually partnered with different brands who gave a small amount of money so that I could actually pay writers from more marginalized backgrounds. So we did a series on Black women's health, where I actually, for the first time ever, had a budget to be able to pay people, which was fantastic. Virtually all of the posts were voluntary, other than that. And then the pandemic hit, And I found myself in this weird sort of situation as a health journalist who was freelance, in that a lot of the publications that had previously been commissioning me very regularly suddenly were not commissioning me at all, because now everyone was writing about health. Like, their political editor was writing about health, their all the in-house staff were writing about health, and so I was kind of sat at home twiddling my thumbs, feeling a bit redundant. Probably the only good thing that Rishi Sunak, our current Prime Minister, ever did was to announce a package of self-employed income support for freelancers like me who found themselves out of work. And so as a result, I could afford to write that book proposal that I'd kind of been thinking about for a couple of years and putting off, and going, oh, I'll do it when I've got time. And it's very difficult, I think, as a freelancer to prioritize unpaid stuff when there is plenty of paid work to be keeping you busy. So that was where Rebel Bodies was really born. It's the one and only thing I thank Rishi Sunak for. And yeah, and what I wanted to do then with Rebel Bodies was, as I was saying to Elle beforehand, was to put all of these stories into context, because I thought, I've got lots of these women's stories now, and I know that this is a systemic, wider structural issue. And I'd started digging into some of the wider research, and again, as Elle and I were discussing before the rest of you joined, there isn't a lot of research, but the research that we have all very much points to the fact that this is a problem. And so I thought, what I need to do is find a way to incorporate these stories and some of the kind of research that proves it, and then also to speak to healthcare professionals about what's going on the other side. Like, why does this stuff happen? Because that always felt like the missing piece for me. And I think particularly in the UK, and I'm conscious obviously that the book is written very much from a UK and an NHS perspective, and that some of you are on the other side of the pond, and it's fantastic to have found some readers over on that side of the pond. But the healthcare systems are different. There are political differences, but certainly the NHS has been in crisis for the last decade, if not a little bit longer. And so I wanted to look at the context of women's health when the system itself is in crisis. And yeah, and so that felt like a fairly large undertaking. I found out I was pregnant about 2 weeks into starting writing the book. So there was also then a fairly hard deadline on when I had to get it finished. But I wanted it really to be as comprehensive as possible. I think I felt frustrated that a lot of what I'd previously read about the gender health gap felt limited, in the sense that it only really focused on reproductive health. So it talked a lot about period and menstrual health related issues, or it talked about menopause, or it talked about childbirth. But I think I'd become, and particularly with COVID kind of raging in the background, become very conscious of how much more of an issue it was. Women are more than just wombs and vaginas. We have all the other organs that everyone else also has. So I wanted it to be looking at healthcare across the board, and to be giving as clear and kind of nuanced, I guess, a picture of what was going on. So it wasn't going to be pitting patients against healthcare professionals, but looking at it from both sides. And I think the other thing that I had been very inspired by, particularly through running Hysterical Women, but also through the wider journalism work that I was doing, was this kind of movement, which I've alluded to, where patient advocates, activists, organizations like Medical Herstory, for example, were springing up and really shifting the conversation. So the way that we talk about women's health and gender health issues today is just wildly different from the way it was 10 years ago, the way it was even 5 years ago. And I wanted to really pay tribute to some of those patient voices and some of the campaigns. And I guess really to inspire people to do something themselves, whatever that may be, you know, to show that there are different ways of doing activism, to show that, you know, it isn't a one size fits all, but that sharing your story, speaking out, you know, lobbying government, writing to your local health board or whatever, there are lots of different ways to tackle this, and really that we have to be tackling it on lots of different fronts. So it was a challenge. It was a challenge writing, particularly in the first trimester of pregnancy when I just wanted to sleep 24 hours a day. But I think I was constantly driven by that inspiration and that feeling that it's such a privilege for me to be able to tell these stories and for people to trust me with their stories. And I really wanted to shine as much of a light as possible on the stories that I had been told, that people had shared with me, and to really celebrate those people who were out there doing amazing things. So there was a lot of interviewing, there was a lot of kind of digging through academic research, and trying to kind of weave it all together, I suppose, and sort of synthesize the issues. I already, again, through my journalism work, had a lot of really fantastic contacts within healthcare. So lots of doctors who I knew were working on issues in their own right, midwives. So really being able to kind of turn to them as well and say, look, what's going on from your side? What are the issues? What are the barriers to you being able to provide the care that you would like to give? And that was such a kind of valuable insight into, you know, the problems with medical training, the problems with understaffing, the problems with yeah, just the kind of relentless time pressures that healthcare staff are under. And yeah, sort of bringing it all together, really. The final thing that came out of a conversation with my agent was that actually we wanted to be able to leave people with some practical tips and some resources as well. So each chapter finishes with a toolkit, where again I spoke to a mixture of patient experts and healthcare professionals about, you know, how to get the best out of kind of navigating the system as it currently is, while also at the same time campaigning for a better system. And so that felt like a really important thing, that, you know, partly just so that people don't go away feeling enraged and depressed and frustrated by the problem, but also feel empowered in some way to go away and do something about it and to get involved and to share their own stories. So yeah, and it came out, it was published in hardback last January. I've just had the most kind of amazing kind of whirlwind of book tours and events and chatting to people about it. And yeah, really, really thrilled with how it's been received, both by patients and healthcare professionals. Yeah, so that's, I mean, that's the story. I'm sure that lots of you have questions, and I wanted to make sure that I left plenty of time for questions. I'm happy to kind of talk in a bit more detail about specific processes or whatever's most useful, really. But if I throw over to questions now, does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again so much, Sarah, for coming to speak with us. It's really amazing hearing about how actually long-standing your journey with gender health equity is, and how it maybe wasn't necessarily something that you always thought you'd do, but you just kind of kept being drawn into it. So that's really, really valuable to hear about. And for those of you who haven't had the chance to read Rebel Bodies yet, obviously, if you are here, you have some interest in gender health equity. And Sarah is so right in that it is so comprehensive. After reading it, I felt like I had a much better foundation into just gender health equity and the principles and all like just the systemic issues which just compound it. So I would truly, truly recommend reading it if you haven't had the chance to. We are now ready to move on to the Q&A session. And as Sarah said, this is your chance to really delve into her experiences, her methodologies as a writer, and discuss her book. If you feel comfortable, please feel free to just use the raise your hand function and say, and just to ask your questions out loud, or I can also read the ones in the chat. I see that we have some here. The first question that we have here, it says, can you go into what trends you heard on, what is missing within medical training, and how that impacts female health outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, again, obviously with the caveat that everyone I spoke to was UK based, so mostly trained in UK medical schools, but I think actually a lot of what is in the book is very universal in terms of the problems and the gaps. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the training, there is a real sense actually that women's health is just missing. Um, you know, and it was things like when you're talking about cardiovascular health, for example, is a really good example. All of the examples in the textbook are male, all of the diagrams are men's bodies. Cardiovascular disease, certainly in the UK, is the biggest killer of women. It kills twice as many women as breast cancer. But if you search for, you know, how to fit the ECG electrodes on somebody's chest, every diagram you will see on Google is a male chest. There is nothing showing you, you know, how do you navigate boobs when you're doing that? So that was one. I think really the kind of the male as default was the overwhelming thing that came up, in the sense that unless you are talking about obstetrics or gynecology, pretty much everything has men as the default, and you're just supposed to extrapolate that knowledge to female bodies, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. I mean, depending on the issue. If you're talking about tonsillitis, then yeah, there's not much difference. If you're talking about strokes or heart attacks, you know, there might be some differences that we need to be aware of. And so that I think is a really key one. I think the other thing, when I was talking to sexual health experts, was that, I mean, my favorite quote from the book, and I was talking about this on a panel a couple of weeks ago, when gynecologists are trained to think about the vagina and the female reproductive system, I was told it's very much in the context of, can you get a penis in and can you get a baby out? So it's the mechanics of having sex, getting pregnant, or avoiding pregnancy. There is absolutely no room within medicine for sexual pleasure for women. I mean, we know that male sexual pleasure is a medical priority. We know you can get Viagra pretty easily over the counter in your local pharmacy. But, you know, even sexual health specialists who I interviewed said the clitoris wasn't taught in medical school. It wasn't taught in my sexual health specialty training. What's that noise? Is anyone else hearing that ringing noise? Where is that coming from? Okay, I don't know what that is. So yeah, so that was a really big one. I think those were kind of the key ones. I mean, obviously, you know, we know in terms of GP training, so general practitioners, I don't know if that is different in the US or Canada, but your kind of family doctor training, there wasn't anything, you know, in terms of issues like menopause, in terms of a lot of kind of common reproductive health issues. What is it? What is it? It's 20 to 5.
I'm aware. Just switch it off.
Sorry. Sorry. It's all kicking off here with family calls. What was I saying? Yeah, so that those really were the kind of key gaps that came up. Yeah. Next question.
Daria, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah. So I'm going to be completely transparent. I think this is kind of an amalgamation of a lot of medical history members' questions that we've been chatting about while we're preparing for this event. But I guess in some ways, on behalf of all of us, what were some of the biggest challenges you faced while researching for this book, especially given the significant disparity in research on women's and gender diverse health issues? And like, how did you kind of navigate finding these hard facts in such an under-researched field? And, kind of, were there any really surprising discoveries or things that really challenged you or surprised you, I guess, in that way?
Yeah, I mean, there obviously isn't a lot of research, and a lot of the research that there is not necessarily super recent, or it's not necessarily UK specific. So a lot of it was just kind of having a look at what was out there and pulling out as much as I could from that. I think it is really challenging when you're trying to do something very evidence-based and the evidence doesn't exist. But equally, I think one of the things that I have often said is that actually what we don't know is kind of in lots of ways more important than what we do know, because it speaks for itself, right? We look at where the research gaps are, and that shows us what's been prioritized and what hasn't been prioritized historically. So I mean, for example, in the chronic illness and disability chapter, I talk a lot about, theories around why women are disproportionately affected by a number of different chronic illnesses. And I spoke to lots of researchers, lots of real kind of like experts in these fields who just said, we don't know. Like we think it's probably to do with hormones, we think it might be this, but the research hasn't been done, and we can't get the funding for the research to find out. And that, I think, actually tells you so much just by not having the research, because it isn't a priority, because nobody's bothered to do it. So yeah, I don't know if that answers that question, but really, yeah, pulling out as much as I could from what was there, but also highlighting what really, really isn't there, and making the point about why that isn't there.
No, I just wanted to say that that's such a inspirational way of putting it, I think, is like the idea of finding kind of like, I don't know, I think often we just try to look at those hard facts and kind of like dig for that. And I think looking at kind of in the inverse is really amazing and can be, I think, applied not to just, I'm sure, a lot of these stories, but kind of in general to the way that we view the world. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question, and thank you for that response. That was definitely a new way to put it for me. So very interesting. Our next question that we have is, how did you find starting out as a freelancer who specialized in a topic that was at the time quite invisible and controversial? Was it hard finding publications who wanted to interact with gender health equity? That's a great question.
It is a great question, and the answer is yes, very much. I think, I guess when I was starting out, the way I approached it was to write more generally around these issues. So, people perhaps didn't want to talk about the gender health gap, but they were interested in really practical articles on the morning after pill, for example, or as I mentioned, what it's like to have an abortion, or stuff that was much more sort of like everyday and relatable to people's lives. I think I was quite lucky in lots of ways that fairly early on in my career, I worked with a number of editors who were prepared to kind of perhaps take a little bit of a chance on me, perhaps take a chance on stories that were not necessarily the obvious ones or the ones that were, you know, super popular. So I did have a couple of really good editors at the debrief, as I mentioned. I had an editor at the iPaper who was very interested in exploring more around women's health, and actually I still write for them very regularly today, and they've always been really kind of supportive and open to my ideas. But I think, you know, when you are first starting out and a topic is not necessarily kind of trending or whatever, it is finding ways in, and that was a lot of what I did early on. I think case study led stories are always a really good way into that, because you're pitching it as this is an awful thing that happened to this one person, and that makes, as awful as it sounds, a really compelling headline that people click on because they want to read about this experience. And then you kind of sneak the feminism in there by stealth. You know, so you can be talking about the fact that, you know, the impact that this has on somebody's life and their symptoms. And, you know, one of the stories that I did quite early on was a very, very young woman. I think she was in her early 20s, and she was essentially making a decision to have a hysterectomy because her PMDD was so severe that she just couldn't function. And so I wrote about what it's like to choose between your mental health and your fertility. And actually, I think that the issues of mental health and fertility are much more relatable, much more kind of an easy sell, I suppose, than talking about the gender health gap straight off the bat. But then once you kind of get into the details of, you know, this is an issue that is under researched, that, you know, at the point at which I was writing about it wasn't recognized by a lot of people within the NHS, that you know, was a real struggle for women to be taken seriously with, and still is today. But finding that way in that readers could relate to, even if they didn't have PMDD, even if they had never heard of PMDD, would click on the link because it was, you know, what would you choose if you had to decide between your mental health and your fertility? Like, how do you weigh those two things up? And then to be able to, yeah, make the point that actually there is this really direct link between mental health and menstrual health that nobody is really talking about yet.
Yeah, thank you for that response. It's very interesting to hear about. I mean, it's awesome that you had some editors who were willing to take a chance on you, but I love what you said about sneaking feminism in there. I think that's a policy we all should try and uphold all the
Oh
time.
yeah, big advocate for feminism by stealth.
Our next question is from Millie, and they said, or they asked, how did you navigate bringing men, for example, male doctors, into the conversation, as they suppose it naturally may be a less emotive topic for them, and they're also interested to know what responses the book has had from men.
Interesting. Yeah. So I think I only spoke to two male doctors for the book, which wasn't necessarily a conscious choice. It was more just, you know, I was reaching out to the people that I already knew who were working in this space. I think it's a really good point, though, that male doctors are not necessarily as engaged in this subject. Although, you know, what I will say is a conversation that I have a lot is people kind of saying, oh, you know, is it just male doctors who are sexist and who don't take women seriously and who dismiss them? And actually, no, I don't think it is. I think in my experience, it can, or certainly from women that I've spoken to, it can quite often be female doctors who are the worst at this because they have their own experience and they assume that it's universal. So they go, oh, well, I'm on my period right now and it's not that bad, like just get on with it. Or I've been to the menopause and I don't know what everyone's making such a fuss about. It's not that bad. So I think, it's important to remember that women aren't necessarily going to always be the most empathetic either. Yeah, in terms of actually answering the question, it's a really good question. I think it is so important that we engage people of all genders in these issues. And it wasn't something that I necessarily kind of consciously thought about while I was writing the book. In terms, though, of the responses I've had since, it has been really positive. I mean, I've not had a huge number of readers who've been male. I did have one guy who I absolutely loved at an event who came up to me, and he was a lecturer in nursing, so already quite unusual in and of itself. And he came up and bought a copy and asked me to dedicate it to his 16-year-old daughter, which I thought was really cool. Loved that guy. So yeah, I think it is really tricky because but equally, every man has a woman in their life who is affected by these issues. I'm always a little bit wary of, this whole, oh, it could be your sister, it could be your mother, it could be your daughter approach, because I feel like you shouldn't have to know someone directly affected by this for it to have an impact. But I think sometimes reminding men of that can be the way in and the way to make them realize. One of my favorite Amazon reviews actually was from a guy who he started the review by saying, "My wife made me read this book." And I thought, oh God, where's this going? Just like strap in. But he actually then wrote a really lovely review talking about how it had made him completely reconsider things that female colleagues might be going through. It had opened his eyes to lots of things. And, I think that is something where I've perhaps not actively, maybe not as much as I should, sort of tried to market it at men. But the men who have sort of found it or had it thrust upon them by their wives do seem to respond to it. So I'm hopeful that we're heading in the right direction. I definitely think we need to get men engaging in this issue a lot more because they still make up a huge proportion of the healthcare profession, and by and large they're the ones in the more senior positions within healthcare and within healthcare management. So absolutely. I did recently, for anyone who's in the UK, give a copy to Wes Streeting, who is currently the Shadow Health Secretary, very likely to be our next Health Secretary. So hopefully he's reading it and digesting it and coming up with some ideas for the next government. We'll see. But yeah, absolutely. I would encourage you to force copies on any man that you may know, particularly med students. Yeah.
Wow, thank you so much for that response. I really liked what you said about making sure. That's also hilarious. We're talking about forcing this upon any males you know. I will be doing that now that I have my own copy. But thank you again for shedding light on just how even the people who you wouldn't necessarily think would have biases by like just virtue of being raised in a biased and sexist system, obviously that's been internalized by pretty much everyone who's lived in that. And so a big part of moving forward is just kind of recognizing the biases that you have by reading books like the ones that you wrote and just trying to unlearn what you've learned your entire life, which is obviously easier said than done,
Yeah,
but it's important. Mhm. Yeah, we just have two more questions left. The second last one that we have here is from Anastasia, and they asked, for people who want to write about women's chronic illness experiences, how do you convince people to care about issues they don't really understand or don't know are serious? That's another really good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I think it's really tricky. I think, probably in the same way that I was saying about the PMDD article, is looking for ways of making it relatable, looking for ways that people can empathize. So it's about shining a light on people's real experiences in a way that makes people think, oh God, how would I cope if that happened to me? Um, what's it like to live with one of these illnesses? What impact does it have on your relationships, on your career, on your social life? And yeah, I mean, it always depends a little bit on the kind of the demographics that you're looking at, but I think there is an increasing amount of awareness and attention paid to chronic illness. I think we are definitely getting there. I'm definitely seeing more in media. And it is honestly, I mean, just a case of finding very strong case studies, finding a way of pitching that story in a way that's going to get an editor's attention and make them go, oh God, yeah, I really need to read that story. And without necessarily being sensationalist about it, but tapping into that kind of inbuilt empathy that we all have, and that, I suppose, curiosity about other people's lives. I think it is particularly difficult with things like, some of the more contested chronic illnesses, so things like ME, where, even some doctors don't believe it's a real thing. I think that in itself, actually, now that we are talking about these issues more openly, is quite an interesting thing to talk about. I've written about the fact that women with ME are gaslit and told it's all in their head. And I think there is more appetite for that kind of thing. I think also things like long COVID have really helped in a lot of ways. Like, that sounds awful because they've obviously been devastating for the people living with them. But from an awareness perspective, long COVID has had so much more awareness and so much more research dedicated to it than many of these long-term conditions have for a very long time. And so I think because that is still being spoken about, perhaps less now than it was a couple of years ago, but I think that is something that you can use as a jumping off point. So perhaps, by writing about long COVID, which again, you can frame it as, I caught COVID 4 years ago. This is what my life is still like now, living with long COVID. You can use that then as a way in to talk about other similar conditions as well that perhaps aren't getting the attention that they should be.
Thank you for that question. Thank you for the response to that question. I'd never thought about that way before, but thinking back, I definitely have seen more news on chronic illnesses recently. And you're right, especially since long COVID started to become more of a thing. So that's a really interesting way to think about it. Thank you. We just have one more question. And it is, can you discuss some of the marketing strategies that you use for this book? And how did you interest those who don't work directly in women's health to read your book?
Great question. So, I mean, I should say that obviously through my publisher, I had a publicist and a marketing manager who did a lot of the kind of heavy lifting for me in terms of that. But a lot of what I have found most interesting and most enjoyable has been more through sort of collaborations with community organizations like yourselves. So certainly when the hardback first came out, I teamed up with a lot of like UK-based women's health campaigns and people in a similar sort of circle. A lot of preaching to the choir, obviously. But where it was reaching, not just people working in women's health, but patients, patients' families, that sort of thing. And then I think wider than that, media really has been the big thing. So doing national radio interviews, national press, magazine articles about the book, is what has helped to kind of take it kind of beyond the people who are already kind of actively engaged in this. And going to events, I've done events in university lecture halls, I've done them in rooms above pubs. And I think word of mouth is a really powerful thing. And it's one of those subjects where, you know, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but once you start talking about it, you just see this kind of avalanche effect. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the same through the work that you're doing. Once you start talking to people about your work, it's like, oh yeah, that happened to me, and oh, I never like connected the dots, but oh yeah, and something else happened to my mum, and then this thing happened to my sister, and I never really like thought of it like that, but now that you've said it, that's really interesting. So I think you do, once you start talking about it, more and more people have stories of their own that they want to share, and that they realize are kind of part of something bigger, part of a bigger picture. Um, so yeah, I mean, marketing, I think like with anything, is a real kind of scattergun approach. You know, you throw lots of things at the wall and see what sticks. And but yeah, I've been really lucky to kind of team up with doing lots of different Instagram lives and things with different charities and patient advocacy groups. Has definitely been one of the really key ones, I think, in terms of reaching people who are very engaged, but perhaps not necessarily, yeah, directly already thinking about this issue.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for your response to that question again. That's really interesting to hear about how many different ways you've engaged with marketing with your book, Instagram lives, lectures. That's quite a repertoire. So it's
Yeah.
it's really interesting to see how in this new age of technology, just sort of the pathways and avenues that are available for marketing. So it's interesting to hear about that. Thank you so much. I think we're just, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, 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 that's great. No, I was just saying.
Mhm. Okay, well, thank you to everyone who attended this event. And thank you so, so much again, Sarah, for coming to talk to us. Your book is amazing, and I really believe it should be considered like a foundational read in the field of gender health equity. And it's so interesting to hear you talk not only about your book, but also your pathway to getting involved in this field. So it's really interesting to hear about that as from more of like a journalist and author perspectives. I believe we may have some aspiring journalists or authors in attendance today, or maybe even current. Now that we've wrapped up the speaker part of our event, we do have a feedback form, which would be really appreciated if everyone who attended could fill out. Is a link going to be sent in chat or just to email afterwards?
I just sent it,
Oh,
so it's in the chat.
perfect. If you could all take the chance, if you attend the event, to fill that out, that'd be so appreciated, because again, then we can gear the events more towards you, and also you can get your attendance for your certification. Um, yeah, and now that we're done that, we're ready to move on to breakout room networking for those that are able to stay. And in the breakout rooms, we really encourage you to continue these conversations. We had some amazing questions in the chat, and also just to sort of build connections with those who are here. But thank you so much again, Sarah. We have so many thank yous
Thank
resounding in the
you.
chat right
Thank
now.
you. Apologies
Um,
again for the unexpected interruption, but thank you so much for having me. It's been really lovely.
No, thank you again for coming. I took so much out of this chat here, and I can tell from the chat that everyone else did too. But yeah, thank you so much. Big
Cool.
virtual round of applause. Like, I know everyone can't clap because that would sound really terrible over Zoom, but